From Audioboom comes Covert, a new podcast that delves into the murky world of spies, soldiers, and top-secret military operations. I'm Jamie Rennell, and together we'll discover the real stories of history's greatest classified missions, told by the operatives, soldiers, and journalists who experienced it firsthand. Follow Covert on Spotify or subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite shows.
Welcome to Audiogyan with Kedar Nimkar, a podcast that documents insightful conversations with Indian designers, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers, and creatives of all types. Catch us on iTunes or visit audiogyan.com for more Gyan sessions. Here's your host, Kedar Nimkar.
Today I have Aarthi Parthasarathy with us on Audiogyan, who's an Indian filmmaker and a webcomic creator. Having grown up in Mumbai and now living in Bangalore, Aarthi is known for creating webcomics like Royal Existentials and writing for webcomic Urbanlore. Aarthi became a part of the feminist art collective called Kadak in March 2016, where she has collaborated to create personal cyberspace, Aloe, Vera, and The Void. Thanks, Aarthi, for giving us your time, and it's a real pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome to Audiogyan.
Thank you, Kedar. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Our discussion today around will be some insights into webcomics I've come up with few questions and let's see how we unravel them as we go along. So I'll start off by asking you about some brief history of women in webcomics or in comics in general around the world or India, whatever's you have studied more, and what's the history of comics around the world?
Okay, so comics itself, they are a medium that started in the late 1800s. It started with a magazine in the UK called Punch.
Okay.
So they started putting these illustrations in sequence with accompanying bits of text. And creating narratives. And Punch was basically a magazine of satire that did a lot of commentary on political issues. So that's how it started. But in the beginning, there were very few women making comics as such. They were illustrating cute things like dogs and cats, and they were creating these bits of they were in advertising. The Cupid dolls, I don't know if you've seen, but they were a big part of advertising lore in the early 1900s in America. So again, like, women were involved in things like that. It wasn't until the suffragette movement that took off in America and Europe, which is basically campaigning for the women's right to vote, that, illustrators and joined the political movement to make the women's vote count in politics. So then women started after they got the right to vote, women started entering the workforce en masse, especially because men were leaving to fight the war. So suddenly you had in factories, in offices, and in comics and illustration, all these women coming in to occupy, spaces that men had vacated. So there's a long history about women in comics, actually, which was part of some research that I did. I gave a talk on it a couple of times in Bangalore and in Bombay. So it's a really fascinating story, how it evolved and grew over the years. And women were slowly entered spaces like DC and Marvel, and then now you have many women involved in writing, lettering, inking, coloring in all these spaces. Colleen Duran is very famous. She was part of Sandman. She was one of the women involved in setting up Sandman. And now you have many women graphic novelists, including Alison Bechdel. But the webcomic has really freed up the
the canvas.
Yeah, in a sense that many women creators have emerged. There's a kind of freedom of content. There's no editing. There's an instant feedback loop that is created with the audience. There are many themes that would have been considered taboo earlier. For example, there's a comic called Oh Joy Sex Toy, which would have been unthinkable, of a few decades ago. The freedom with which it speaks about certain issues, and it's basically an educational webcomic, and it tries to dispel a lot of myths.
Okay.
And
this is what, 2000? When did it
in the 2000s.
Okay.
Post. So basically, when the medium of webcomics opened up, now there are many famous examples, like XKCD is one, which is really. Which became really huge. Yeah. So there are many women who occupied the space, right up to right now, women from other spaces, minorities of different kinds. There's Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan, who's a Pakistani superhero. So there's been basically a feedback loop that has been created through webcomics, which has addressed issues of representation and identity politics, and has come back to the mainstream in this form. So comics have gone through a fascinating journey, and it's really amazing to see the space they're in right now. The publishing industry has changed ever since Mouse won the Pulitzer Prize. I think it was in 1991 or 92. And that's when, I guess, they got a certain gravitas, seriousness was attributed to the medium. After which you had many biographies coming in, like Persepolis by Marianne Satrapi, or Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and Are You My Mother? So, comics have really evolved, and women in comics have really...
But again, in general, as far as the history goes, is it really just 200 years, 250 years old, or has comic been far more before?
So comics as we understand it, yes, about 200 years old. But sequential art has been there for a long time. From, you could trace it right back to the cave paintings. Which show a certain sequence of, and the act of hunting, or the act of making a fire. Or there are many things that have been documented in cave paintings, even in Patachitra, or even in miniature paintings of different kinds, even whether you're looking at
covered storytelling.
Covered. Even in some kinds of Gond and Madhubani painting, there is a certain sequence to a story that unfolds as you look at it.
Correct.
So, there are many different kinds of sequential art forms in India, which don't traditionally fall into the narrative of the traditional comic as we look at it.
Correct.
Which is also why I was interested in doing this kind of research. So the talk that I give comes from a Western understanding of looking at comics, but I try to kind of insert some Indian examples along the way as well. So that's been part of also my effort in trying to document Indian miniature painting, where I'm really interested in putting together examples of Indian sequential art and looking at how that's actually really unique in itself, and we don't need to really look at a Western paradigm when it comes to sequential art.
Cool. The next thing which I want to ask you is, like, you're a filmmaker also, right? So how did you get into comics? I mean, this is slightly a personal question, but I just want to understand, is there a parallel thread or like an underlying current which you observed, which is common in both? Or how did you venture into comics also?
Right. Actually, I think the people who know me from when I was small, I think their question would be, how did you get into filmmaking?
Okay.
Because comics were, I think, a more natural progression, though it was on hold for some time. I grew up with a crazy collection of comics. That's all I spent my money on, and that's all I did.
Okay.
I collected, everything from Archie's to British comics to my brother's G.I. Joe comics. It was, and our house, my mother used to complain that you can't read when we're eating. It was that kind of obsession. So that's how it started. I was always very interested in films. From a very writerly bent of mind initially.
Okay.
And then it kind of, as I went to design school. So there I kind of learned how to engage with film as a holistic, in a holistic kind of way. So writing, editing, directing, all these things opened out to me, and then I fell in love with it. There's a point that I can identify where I fell in love with the whole process of filmmaking. And there's a lot of commonalities between comics and filmmaking. Because when you understand how a narrative works and how to unfold it visually, how to use pause, how to create a build-up, how to make a certain emotion or line land. These things seem to be common across both the mediums. Of course, the actual mechanics of how it works in each medium is different, but the principle is the same.
Okay, interesting. And has it helped overall in the journey?
Yeah, of course, because I have collaborated with artists in comics. And when I write a script, it comes from a very, even when I discuss it, I'm always saying, oh, so this happens, then we cut to, and then sometimes they'll be like, you mean the next panel? And I'll be like, yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah. The next question is, I've been following your work for quite some time, and obviously the articles, if you read about you and what are published online, there is some sort of a message which you want to communicate. I don't know whether we should call it like a rebel to communicate certain things, but do you believe that comics or web comics are a means to make yourself heard, and what you want to communicate, and how impactful, if yes, then how impactful it has been?
Right. Yes. I think I haven't really consciously thought of whether I'm trying to communicate something. Often I react to whatever is happening around me. And I think that's, as an artist, that's what you have to do at all times. You have to be very honest about whatever you're engaging with. And of course, think through it very carefully and address all different kinds of nuance. And then put out as honestly as you can what you're feeling. And
but are there any expectations while putting it out, apart from just being appreciated, or
no, I don't even. I actually see the webcomic I used to make. I'm really surprised because when I would make it, I would be like, this is really niche. Because, my parents would be like, what is this pretentious way they're speaking? Nobody talks like this. And then I would say, yes, that's the idea. So correct. They would tell me, oh, it's tough to understand. They would enjoy it, but they would be like, I don't know who reads this. I would be like, even I don't know who reads this. So I was actually quite surprised when it got some attention. Yeah, I wasn't expecting it. I guess my effort is to kind of try to create some kind of political discourse.
Okay.
Which is that when things are happening around you, you have to engage with them. You have to say something in some way. There's no pressure there. It's a question of whether you're ready, whether you're willing to engage with it. Some people, and I really, I'm conflicted about this. Some people want to say something, but they also don't want to affect their mental health in certain ways. And I understand that dilemma. So I'm not saying that it's everyone should do it, but whoever feels compelled to should definitely, engage in some way. It's very important to create different kinds of political discourse. There are so many people on ground who are doing such important, amazing work.
Correct.
Sitting in our offices and our studio spaces, if we can contribute in some way, we should. And that's generally been the effort in at least my comic writing, which is that we, as Kadak, we've made work that addresses different themes of gender, sexuality, caste, class.
Okay.
So it's important to shake up existing notions about this, about these issues. And there's a lot of that to do, especially in a country like India at a time at a time like this, where only one kind of discourse seems to be spreading.
Yeah.
And the diversity of discourse is a little bit in danger right now. And I think as artists and practitioners, we have to keep a certain diversity going. Otherwise, a single voice is never good for art.
Yeah. It looks flat. Yeah.
It's a big danger. And I'm really concerned. It's all over the world. And people say, it's
phase.
It's a phase. People say that it's just the way things are. I don't know. I'm not so sure.
So I've been preparing some questions for Arijit Singh, and the topic I've named is like the art of dissent. I mean, when you want to speak something at a political level or move things around. So on the same lines, I want to ask you that did you face any criticism for your work because it has been too open, like you have been too open about it?
Yeah, I mean, it ranges a little bit from someone. This I had also mentioned at the panel, which is once I used to tweet the comic every week, and someone was like, "Why don't you ever criticize the Congress? Why don't you ever criticize the Congress?" And then I said, "But I don't criticize the BJP. I'm not naming anybody here." And this is the thing. This was one kind of criticism where I would try to write a comic that was as critical of people in America as it is of people here. Yeah. Because I feel the underlying thing is the same.
Correct.
There's a certain human attitude that is common across all societies. When there's a certain way that power expresses itself, when there's a certain kind of struggle of ego, identity politics, these things are common across. And how privilege plays out in a society, patriarchy, it's common across all societies. So that I'm quite fascinated with that.
Correct.
That you could have, if you stripped it down to a certain kind of dialogue, you would find that a certain script has as much resonance in Europe as it does here.
Correct. And it's abstracted to a certain level. Yeah.
So that would be one thing. And then the other kind of criticism would be, why aren't you naming anything directly? You are escaping. And this is something I've heard a lot. And I would try to say, no, I'm not escaping. I'm really I'm trying to look at the commonality here. I understand that it's seen as some kind of a cop-out. And I fully understand where that's coming from. Especially now, I feel that yes, certain things have to be named, because the more you abstract, people feel that they can get away with anything.
Correct.
So it's a bit of a dilemma for me. I have put a pause on the comic because I went through a health issue recently, so I had to put a pause on the comic. But coming back to writing right now, I think I'm in a position where I would want to address certain things more head on than I used to.
Oh, nice. I'll be looking forward. In fact, a lot of people would be looking forward for it. Aarthi, the next thing which I want to know is, which you briefly mentioned about Royal Existentials comic. So in that, I see a peculiar vintage style, right? So what was the thought behind it? I understand it you briefly, but I would like to elaborate more on that. Like, what was the process of coming up with that form of styling? And what was the source of inspiration as well?
Okay, so essentially it started out as a personal project on Indian art history. So this is something that I'm very interested in, and I was very bothered about the fact that literally nothing is available online. I would read, books by B.N. Goswami, etc. But I wanted, I think, a more contemporary way of understanding or looking at it, which I wasn't finding. And if you type Indian miniature painting, I find that at least Indian museums, they don't have a very good presence online. And most of the images are in foreign museums. And even the studies are all foreign. And this irked me to some extent, I would say. So I basically, started just putting down some notes about, and I had these images in a folder. Meanwhile, so many things happened at the same time. I used to read a lot of webcomics online. So yeah, I would actually spend inordinate amounts of time at the cost of my actual day job. And one of them was a webcomic called Wondermark by David Malky. He's a California-based comic artist. And what he does is he remixes kind of Victorian era woodcuts and illustrations, lithoprints and all. And he kind of repurposes them into comics. And I found that absolutely hilarious. So I would read and reread Wondermark all the time. And then I would keep telling, so my friend Chaitanya and I, we've set up a studio together called Falana Films. So we would work together and I would keep laughing and I would be like, somebody should make an Indian version. Somebody should make an Indian version, especially because the situation in India was just ripe for satire. I mean, you don't need to look very far to find something funny, especially in our current tragicomic scenario. So then one day he was like, you should make it. So then, and I kind of laughed it off. And then that evening we had edited something and I had put it to render. I had about like 2-3 hours free because my machine was busy. So on my laptop, I just took one and I made a comic. The image itself was funny. So basically, it's the image is actually of a couple, but the man looks old enough to be her father. So she's complaining about the fact that, the state of affairs in the kingdom. And actually the artist has left her hand undrawn. And the older male figure brushes it all. And he's like, oh, you're just complaining because they forgot to draw your hand. And it was just like a silly joke that I just put together. And he said, oh, you should make more. I showed it to Chaitanya. And he said, you should put it up, make more. So he said, make it a weekly thing. He was just pushing me. And then, so that's how it started. When I put it up, I said, okay, we'll make one every week. And then there was suddenly this deadline, and this thing that I was supposed to enjoy became very stressful. And for no reason. There was no audience. Nobody cared that whether, there would be a comic every week or not. But it was some kind of pressure that I gave myself. I was like, no, I should be diligent about it and I should meet this deadline. And suddenly after 9 or 10 of them, that's like 2.5 months, then people started paying attention and looking forward to the next one. And then I was like very surprised. Then it got some attention, and then people started making their own versions of the same idea.
Okay.
Which I was very happy to see. In fact, people, there's Mad Mughal memes, there's Inedible India. So all this started like almost a year or so after Royal. And I think it was definitely in a much more accessible language than Royal. And I was very appreciative of the whole thing. And some of it was really biting satire that named people. So I was like, okay, they're definitely doing something that maybe I hesitated or it didn't come naturally to me. It came very naturally to the creators of those pieces. So overall it was great. And then a lot of people wrote into me, and I started collaborating on other kinds of comics.
Okay.
So it opened out a different world of comic writing to me.
Aarthi, this one is the last one which I want to ask you. Is in terms of balance between content and the image which you are using, or the illustrations which are there, is there supposed to be a balance between them to be more impactful to the viewer or the reader? If yes or no, whatever the case is, what's the kind of balance? Is there any balance required also?
Yeah, of course there's a balance required. Both of them have to work with each other somehow. Either they can...
No, in terms of balance is not just the visual balance, but in terms of the weightage also it carries. Like sometimes there are comic strips which are purely visual with just one line. There are sometimes which are very heavy on narration. So what kind of is there any observation as to this kind of artwork or this kind of comic has more impact or no?
Not really. I mean, see, even if the text isn't visible within the comic, there is still a narrative. Even if it's a completely silent comic, there is some narrative that is being unfolded through the sequence of imagery, through what's happening in each page/panel. That's one thing. Secondly, there are many comics that are very word heavy. Like, for example, Joe Sacco's comics. Which basically he does, what he engages with is called comic journalism. So he goes to conflict areas and draws and writes out his personal narratives in comic form. And they're very, very, very compelling stories. Very heavy, very difficult to read. And but you never feel, because you never feel that, there's too much text here.
Why?
Because of the kind of story that it is, the way he tells it.
Okay.
So, and...
Then it could be might as well like a novel, right? Like it has to be a graphic thing.
Because there's the way he observes his characters, the way he draws them out, the moment of time that he chooses to freeze. It's very... I don't think it would be as effective as a novel.
Okay.
It definitely wouldn't, carry that certain rawness of emotion that he made a beautiful book about Palestine.
Okay.
Which is really, at certain points, it's really visceral. I've never been able to read it at one stretch. I've always had to put it down because it asks really difficult questions. And that's the kind of impact that he wants to have. And he manages to have it. I mean, at least for me as a reader. I don't know, maybe for somebody else it would not work the same way. I don't want to assume. But so in terms of the balance, it depends to a large extent on the creator or the collaborators who are working on it.
Okay.
what comes naturally. Because like someone like Apu Pen can make an entirely silent book, which will not have one bit of text.
Okay.
But it'll have a beautiful narrative that will evoke this amazing feeling, amazing set of feelings, and you'll just be left with that, and someone like Joe Sacco could use reams of text and create another kind of feeling. So it really depends on what comes naturally to that creator or creators, and how they, use their style and their narrative voice in their own distinctive way.
Yeah, I think I'm done with my questions. I've just started exploring this field and obviously would like to deep dive further. I think this is a good note to end this. Thank you,
Okay.
Aarthi, for giving us your time, and it was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much, Kedar.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. Catch us on iTunes, Saavn, Stitcher or any podcasting app you use. Do rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Stay tuned for more Gyan on Audiogyan.com. Till then, bye.
From Audioboom comes Covert, a new podcast that delves into the murky world of spies, soldiers, and top-secret military operations. I'm Jamie Rennell, and together we'll discover the real stories of history's greatest classified missions, told by the operatives, soldiers, and journalists who experienced it firsthand. Follow Covert on Spotify or subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite shows.